Anyway, this night in Camden, I met Ozzy, and we got chatting, and he said, look, I want to put a band together. Would you be interested? And I said, yep, sure. Let's give it a try. So David Arden phoned me from Jet Records in London, and he said, I've got you a train ticket. Will you go up to Ozzy's, meet him, and have a play together, see if it's going to work? I said, yeah, sure. So I went up on the train to Stafford. Ozzy was there to pick me up in his car at the railway station. And I got to his house, and he had a couple of other guys there, a drummer and a guitarist. And I don't know who they were, and I can't remember their names. But, they were nice blokes, and they were decent enough players and pretty good, but I wasn't sort of like knocked out. There was no real spark there. It was okay. It wasn't bad. They were nice guys and good players, but there was no real chemistry, So I went out to the kitchen with Ozzy, and I said, Ozzy, look, if you want to get serious about this, I said, I'd like to form a band with you, but I don't think these two other guys are sort of world class. He said, oh, okay, hang on a minute. And he walked he had a little rehearsal room built integrally on his house. So he went into there where these guys were. He said, oh, you can pack up, fellas, it's not working out, you can go home. And that was it, they were gone on the spot,
If I'd been a yes man and said, oh, okay, I'll do whatever you want, let's do it, blah, 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 there would be no Randy Rhoads, and there would be no that version of Blizzard of Oz, So he said, I saw another guitarist in LA. He's really good. He's he teaches music at a school. And I said, well, who's that? And he said, oh, his name's Randy Rhoads. Well, when he said he teaches music at a school, I sort of visited an older bloke with pipe and slippers and glasses or something. But he said, no, he's a young whiz kid. And I said, well, let's get him over. And that's how it started, just me and Ozzy in his kitchen. And then he phoned Jet Records then, and he spoke to Arthur Sharpe. He was the one who introduced Ozzy and me at a gig in London. And Ozzy phoned Arthur, and he said, oh, Bob and I get on like a house on fire. The fire brigade's just left. That's what he said. It was just. But he said, then we asked David Arden then, who was taking care of the day-to-day management, and we said, can we fly this guitarist over that Ozzy saw in LA? And he wouldn't at first. He didn't want to. He said, well, he's unknown. He's a kid. Nobody knows who he is. He's got no reputation. We'd rather keep the band UK-based and blah, 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 So. But after a while, he relented, and he said, well, okay. And I still remember his words. He said, against my better judgment, I will fly this kid over. And he got Randy over, and we met up in Jet Records late 79. I think it was about November 79. And that's when Randy and Ozzy and I went up on a train together to Ozzy's house. Well, I think we only stayed 1 or 2 nights. It might have been just one night, that first night. And Randy and I had a play together with a friend of Ozzy's that was sitting in on drums. He wasn't really considered for the gig, but he was a friend of Ozzy's, and he could play and keep a beat. So we just had a little jam with him. And at the end of the first jam, Randy and I looked at each other, and we virtually said the same thing at the same time, like, oh, good playing, or I like you playing, or something like that it was. But we said it together at the same time to each other. So we knew then straight off, well, this is going to work. It feels good. It feels right.
Lee wasn't there for the first album. We were writing the first album while auditioning drummers. And Lee came in at the very end after we had all the material for that first album written. So, we were auditioning drummers, trying them out. Some, were there for a few days. Some lasted a couple of hours. A couple of times we thought, oh, this guy might be good, but he didn't quite work out.
What did Ozzy?
And at that time, we were writing stuff. Randy had riffs and he had ideas, and it was usually Randy and I would sit on a chair opposite each other and work things out together musically. Most of the main riffs were Randy's, but the music part we did together. Now, what we'd do then would be to play a sort of idea of a song, a backing track kind of thing, and Ozzy would sing a melody over it. And a lot of his melodies were very good. Ozzy was, melodic in his vocal tunes, his melodies. And then there weren't any other lyricists in the band. Well, I'd written songs in the past, but I didn't regard myself as, well, I'll be the lyricist. But we wanted to keep the writing within the band, and Ozzy had never written lyrics. Geezer Butler wrote them in Black Sabbath.
Yeah.
Randy wasn't a lyricist, and neither was Lee, really.
Yeah.
So I said, well, look, I remember we were rehearsing at a place in Wilketshaw, which is in Suffolk, in England, a place called Trans Am Trucking. It was a rehearsal place, and I came down one morning, and Ozzy and Randy had been trying to write lyrics for one of the songs, and it was awful. I just said, oh no. I said, look, I'd better do the lyrics. And so it was sort of like necessity was the mother of invention, because I started doing the lyrics then, and I just wrote lyrics that would fit with Ozzy's phrasing and his melodies, and that's how it all worked, Randy and I put music together. We played the backing tracks for Ozzy to sing over. He sang a melody on them, and then I would take a tape away of his melodies and phrasing and write lyrics to it. So, I tend to be credited for lyrics, but I did a lot of the music with Randy as well.
And I got a phone call from Ozzy, a guy called Ozzy Hoppy from Germany, who was a manager and agent, and he told people in the industry that I was not working. I was doing a solo album, and Ozzy Osbourne said, "Get him up to an audition. Let's try him." So they phoned me up and said, "Would you fancy joining an Ozzy Osbourne band?" And I said, "No. I'm not interested in joining any band unless I'm part of it. I'll join if I'm a fifth member or a fourth member, because I've had enough arguments in politics with the other band that I gave virtually my life for." So they said, "Okay, what we'll do, we'll get you M Studios in Shepperton, and we'll do an audition." And I said, "Yeah, I'll audition you, you audition me." We went to Shepperton's M Studios in Shepperton, set up the equipment. I saw Randy. I'd never seen him before, didn't know who he was. And I knew Bob Daisely. Ozzy came in, sat down in his brown fur fox, and I turned around and I said, "Okay." They said, "What do you want to play?" And we played I Don't Know first. And as we started doing it, Randy just jumped up and went, "We got ourselves a friggin' drummer." And he came over to me, jumping up and down, hugging me, and Bob was smiling. And then Ozzy said, "Rhoads, we got to choose a band." And I went, "Yep, all right, if we're a band," and then I'm in. And Ozzy turned around and said, "Here's me hand, here's me heart. This band will never part." And I went, "That's cool. That's all I needed. You're from the singer, his words, we're a band." And that's when we started working.
Okay. And I'd known Lee for many years. Yes, I did tours with him. He was in Uriah Heep. So he comes walking in and I go, "Oh, Lee, what the fuck?" And he's like, "Hey, what's going on?" And,
one familiar face.
So we set them up. We set him up in the middle of the room, and basically everybody was around them. And Randy's stuff went down into the stone room to fire up the stone steps, and that's how we did. A lot of Randy's stuff was done firing out of that room up the stone steps, and that made a lot more sense sonically. One of the mistakes that Chris made was underneath the control room. This is an old 16th century barn, and it wasn't very high. It had big gables like this, and underneath the control room basically was a stone room or a concrete room, but it's only 7 feet high. And Chris made the mistake of putting the drums in there, and I tried to explain to him that this room is too small. So it's just, it's going to everything's just going to go. And that's exactly what happened. And I tried to explain to Chris, but he wanted to do his own thing. So I left it alone. But I felt that it sounded really quite bad, and so I would say to Chris, yeah, dude, you should go down on the studio floor and talk to the guys, man to man and all that stuff. So he'd be like, yeah, good idea, So he went down there, and I'd close the door, and then I'd like turn off all the headphones, and I'd rebalance it and try and make it sound as good as possible. And then the band would come up to the control room and listen. So we did this for about 4 or 5 days. And then I was just like, he's not getting it, because normally I would set up a balance and I wouldn't move stuff around that much. I would try to improve on the balance and tweak it. But Chris was from a different school. He would pull down all the faders, zero everything, and then just build it from scratch real quick. And to me, that's like, okay, look, you learned what to do, and now you just threw all that away, and now you're trying to recreate it again. And that's not the way I would work. And people can do that. And it's just a different way of working. But after about 5 days, I said, look, I said to myself, I'm not going to do this anymore, because he's not getting it. He's not seeing the way forward with it, really.
Yeah.
And so eventually I stopped rebalancing it, and the band would come in, and then they all kind of looked at each other, and there was like some raised eyebrows. And so eventually they said, look, Chris, this isn't working out, blah, blah, blah. And then OZZY called me. He was sitting up in Tony Andrews, Frank Andrews' brother, had a house just a bit north of the studio, right up there we could walk to. So OZZY called me on the intercom, and he said, oh, come up here, I want to talk to you. So I went up there, and he goes, dude, typical OZZY, dude, what the fuck? It's all, and I'm like, well, he goes, dude, that guy's fucking gone. Can you do it? So I go, yeah, sure, Oz. He goes, all right, you're doing it. And that was it, So I go, all right. Typical,
and you know what? And Chris again has created masterpieces as well. We're not knocking Chris here. No.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
I'm a huge fan of Chris Tsangarides as well. And Painkiller and the list.
Well, we became the correct or the ideal environment for Randy to be in and to shine and to become himself and break out of any restrictions and he just, you could see him developing as we progressed. You see that it was a heavy band, and he hadn't been in a heavy band before. Lee Kerslake from Uriah Heep, heavy band. OZZY from Sabbath, heavy band. I'd just come out of Rainbow, a heavy band. So he was surrounded with people that were really the right environment for him to be in, to start to develop and shine, and obviously we had an influence on him as he had an influence on us.
Everything went by OZZY. If OZZY liked it, it was cool. If he didn't like it, then we'd fix it. Certainly it wasn't just like fucked up and in a corner. Well, not always.
Not always. On occasion.
We do the vocals, and it might take, and OZZY does one line at a time, and then he doubles it.
Okay.
So that's why you had on the original album, you had like oi, oi, oi. And there was only 3 of them. Then when they did the remix, they echoed it. So it was like oi, 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 oi. But when he originally did it, we were working with just 2 tracks. So he'd go, okay, roll it. He'd sing the first one, and then he'd like hold his hand up, and I'd stop the tape, and he'd go, how was it? And I'd go, yeah, not bad, OZZY. Go, do it again. So he punched the first line again, and maybe after 2 or 3 takes, I go, yeah, pretty good, that one. OZZY go, all right, double it. So I put him on the other track, and he doubled the first line.
Oh, okay.
And he'd go, how was it? And I go, not bad, OZZY. Go, do it again. And then he'd do it again, and he'd get that OZZY sound of his vocal, which he's been doing for many years. For sure. Tight double, and that's his sound, even from Black Sabbath. So you get one, and then you hear the sound, you hear it phasing, flanging with itself, And you go, yeah, that's a good one. And I go, right, next line. So you do the vocal like this. It takes about 6 or 7 hours to do the vocal. And in between, he's having a slug of scotch, or doing something else. Mostly having a slug of scotch.
Sure.
And I remember I would punch in, and he wouldn't be singing. And I'd like solo it up real quick and crank it up, and I could hear this hissing sound. And he was actually just standing there taking a piss on the floor by the side of the mic. And I'd be like, do it again. So I'd be like, oh, shit. And then one of the times I punched in, he was throwing up. But, most of the time he was very good. And actually, we did have the chance to listen to those multi-tracks many years later, actually. And they are actually exemplary. They're really, really good. I mean, his singing is really good. There's no tuning on any of that stuff. That stuff is as it is.
Ozzy was integral. He was certainly a big part of the finished songs. I mean, you could have the greatest riff in the world, but if it hasn't got a great vocal melody over it, or some decent phrasing with that melody, it loses. It's not finished. It's like a good example of that is the Beatles stuff. They had some great music, and their melodies were wonderful, and their harmonies and that. But if you look at the music and then take away their melodies, the songs wouldn't have been near as good. So Ozzy was certainly valuable in melodies and lyrics, melodies and phrasing, for my lyrics, which was good for me to sit down with a tape, and Ozzy would just sing nonsense, just anything that came into his head, to give me the idea of how he would sing it, where the phrasing went, and the melody, and then I would write lyrics that would, suit the song and put it all together that way. So between us all, it worked well.
Wonderful thing was, not only Blizzard of Oz and Diary of a Madman, we were left alone. There was no one came in halfway through and went, oh, I don't think much of them. They just left us to it. And that was what we wanted, because we knew we had a good engineer in the studio, Max Norman. He was fabulous. So we had him, and then we had me and Bob's knowledge on guitar solos and producing and double tracking, and all those ideas we put in, so we had no one to stop us. That's why they came out so well. That was the reason why.
I remember that we set up, he wanted to rehearse the solos, so I would make, and it's an old story, but I would make him a quarter-inch 2-track mix of 15 seconds before the solo, all the way through the backing track, and then 15 seconds after the solo. And I would make about 15 or 20 of these copies onto one big long reel, so that he would be able to play it. We didn't have a remote down in the studio, so he would go up to the control room and hit play, and this thing would go for about, it was at 7.5 IPS, so it would go for probably about 45 minutes, and there would be maybe 10 or 12 or 14 runs of the solo, and then he'd go down and he'd play the solo, and then he'd wait for the next one to come up, and then he'd play it again, and he would just practice and practice and practice. And while he was doing this, we would go, this would usually be after dinner. We'd have dinner about 5:30, 6 o'clock. And then he would go back into the control room and put on his tape, and we would go up to the pub for a couple of hours and have a few beers, and then we would come back and say, hey, are you ready? and he'd be like, no. And so we'd, wait around for a little longer, and then, then Ozzy would be like, Randy, what the fuck? And then when we started to put down the solos, we'd get one really good.
Did he map it? Like a lot of guitarists map it?
Written out. I mean, the actual solos were written out. Yeah, the end solos, of course, were mostly ad lib, but the actual solos were worked out and written out. Not so much written out, but he knew what was going on.
Yeah.
They were mapped out, and so we would get a really good one, and he didn't want to punch anything in. I think we did a few punches, but for the most part, he would try and do them beginning to end. And once we got a good one, you go, okay, let's double it. And I'd be like, oh, okay.
Oh, wow.
There it goes, And but he would do a really good job of doubling it. And then he said, "Oh, let's triple it." And I was like, "Oh shit," because you've only got 24 tracks, which is only 23 tracks because you've got time code on one of the tracks, and then you've got kick, snare, hi-hat, stereo tom, stereo overhead. So you've got 7 tracks of drums. Then you got bass, two bass tracks. So you're not looking at a lot of tracks here. So, and then you got a couple of rhythm tracks, and then, you know, by the time you get to the lead, you're looking at about 3 or 4 tracks that you've got open. And so Ozzy freaked out when, you know, he came up to listen, and he, you know, started doing his Ozzy, you know, groove, you know, and he goes, "What the fuck?" And I said, "Oh, it's triple tracked, Ozzy." And he went, "What the fuck, Randy?"
Well, You Looking at Me, Looking at You was one of the first songs that we wrote. I think Goodbye to Romance was one. You Looking at Me was another one. They were early songs. And You Looking at Me, Looking at You was supposed to be on that first album. But when Lee came into the band, he hadn't had a hand in writing any of the songs. So when we were at Ridge Farm recording that first album, we said, well, let's at least write a new song that can go on maybe the first single as a B-side. So we wrote No Bone Movies, and that was the last thing that we wrote, and that was at Ridge Farm as we were recording that first album. But once we heard No Bone Movies as a sort of finished song and recorded, we thought we kind of prefer this to go on the album rather than You Looking at Me. So You Looking at Me became the B-side of Crazy Train, and No Bone Movies went on the album as an album track.
First of all, the story goes a little deeper than just that. There's a Quiet Riot song called Laughing Gas, and most of D is the guitar solo. So what Randy did was he just made it into a classical composition. And they said, the record company said, we don't really think that belongs on this album. And Ozzy went to bat for Randy and said, if Randy wants this on here, it stays. And so that's how it got included. Yeah, but the origin of that is actually in a song called Laughing Gas. And most of it is in the solo, but he just took it and made it into a classical. And of course, it's dedicated to my mom because her name was Dee. Dolores, when she was little, people called her Dee. Yeah.
I know, he's dreaming. He knew Bon Scott, but Bon Scott died after I'd written the lyrics for Suicide Solution.
And what was it about?
It was my title, and it was about Ozzy. It was inspired by Ozzy's drinking, because he was drinking himself into oblivion lots of days, you know, and it was affecting him. And I even had to talk to him about it one day, you know, and I said, fucking hell, Ozzy, you know, he was getting drunk during the day. I said, what happens if we find a drummer that we really like and we want him in the band and he thinks, nah, fuck this, Ozzy's, you know, drunk all the time, I wouldn't want to know, you know, because don't forget, the band was unknown and had just been signed, and Ozzy didn't have the best reputation in the world for being, you know, after being fired from Black Sabbath, of, you know, being professional or reliable. So I had a word to him about it. But Suicide Solution was inspired. It wasn't just about Ozzy, but it was inspired by how Ozzy was with his drinking and that, you know. And and I wrote those lyrics about his drinking, or as a warning to anybody that's drinking themselves, you know, into an early grave. You know, how he's got the audacity to say that he wrote the lyrics about Bon Scott when he didn't write any of the lyrics.
Yes.
They were being sued by that young lad's family.
Yeah.
That killed himself because they said, oh, he had, you know, they had that record on his turntable when they came home and he'd shot himself. And in those days it was vinyl, and the side that had been playing was the side of that had Suicide Solution on it.
Yeah.
But Suicide Solution wasn't about advising anybody to kill themselves. It was about advising people against killing themselves with alcohol.
Yeah. Yeah.
So and so OZZY, I remember I had to talk to their lawyers at the time, because if I hadn't written the lyrics, they wouldn't have come to me, but their lawyers came to me to get a statement about what the song was about, because I'd written the lyrics. So I did a statement for them, and that must have been read out in court. And I told them it was it's not advising anybody to kill themselves.
Yeah.
I wrote it as a warning against killing yourself with alcohol, and that's all the song was about. The keyboard intro came from a guy that came down that had worked with Jet Records before, and this whole story's in my book. I even name him. I won't now at this time, but
sure.
I name him and what he'd done and who he was. And when we were doing Crowley, he did a little intro. I've got it on tape. I've got all those writing sessions of that on tape. People call it the Holy Grail, because it's like, the writing and rehearsals of all those songs when we're first putting them together. But I've got on one of the tapes that I've got is his keyboard intro to Mr. Crowley. Now it's very similar to what Don Airey did. Don Airey embellished it and elaborated on it, but the basis of it came from that guy that came down to Monmouth. We're in Monmouth, which is on the Welsh border, the border between England and Wales.
Sure.
There's a town called Monmouth, and we have a sort of a live-in situation where we were writing and auditioning drummers and all that. So this guy was sent down by Jet Records to come down and have a play with us, see if it worked out, and he did this little intro to Crowley. So I had the tape of it, and I played it to Don Airey. And so when we went into Ridge Farm to record the song, Don had embellished and elaborated on that keyboard solo that this guy had done.
I know that Don came in, and we were very excited because he had a CS80, which was a multi-timbre, multi-note synthesizer, which was very new at that time. And it also had the strip where you could do the glissando thing. You could do the sliding thing. It had that weird sort of like Velcro strip on the top.
Yeah, it's a great intro. It's a beautiful sound.
So that was very cool, and it was I forget what they call it, but it had like 8 voices, so you could play 8 notes at once, whereas normally it was like a minimum of 1 note at once. So that was very awe-inspiring. And a studio, we had good mics. It was a new SSL 4000, and a lot of people are saying, "Oh, you must have used all these great mic preamps and all this kind of stuff." And I said, "No, I didn't use any mic preamps. It just went into the console, and that's the way it was." 90% of this stuff comes from the player, drummer, bass player, guitar player. If you've got a great drummer, bass player, and guitar player, you don't need to be a great engineer to make it sound. This shit sounds good.
That was the case. That was definitely the case.
A lot of the reason that record sounds so good is because the players are fucking good, and that's really what it is. I was just, I just get a clean signal, no distortion, make sure it was good. And you've done 90% of the work right there. I think they were both B-sides as far as I recall.
Okay. Were they recorded in the same sessions as the Blizzard of Oz sessions? That's what I'm getting at.
I know that one of them we did down at Southampton when we were doing a live show. I went down there with a truck, and we recorded a live show down there. And we had one track, and then Randy came into the truck and plugged into a pedal and did the solos on it. And that was one B-side, and I don't know which one of those it was. There are many historians that remember all this stuff. But
probably, yeah. It's all good.
And then they were out on tour, and they came back into the studio to do a couple of B-sides because they had singles, and they didn't want to, you know, bust out all the tracks on the single. So we needed some B-sides, and I remember that they came in. It was like a 3-day thing, and I remember OZZY came in, and they were all kind of beat. They were road beaten, and OZZY went up into the control room, and I was setting up the drums and setting up mics, and then OZZY came down, and he was a little drunk. And
the Blizzard of Oz was supposed to be in big writing, and we said, we don't mind if you want to put something on the album cover that says featuring the voice of Black Sabbath or featuring Ozzy Osbourne or, you know, whatever. We don't mind. But instead, what did they do? They put Ozzy Osbourne in big writing and the Blizzard of Oz in smaller writing, which made it look like an Ozzy Osbourne album called The Blizzard of Oz. But it wasn't. Randy and I went in and had meetings at Jet Records a few times about the band name, because they were talking about just calling it Ozzy Osbourne or the act just Ozzy. And we said no, because we were doing way too much. We weren't sidemen, and we weren't just sort of hired to do somebody's solo album. You know, it was we were writing everything and putting everything together.
Randy was constantly pushing himself to get better, constantly practicing, playing. He'd sit there at dinner with a guitar and be just playing the guitar, you know, when waiting for the pudding to come out, you know, stuff like that. You know, the guy was playing the guitar morning, noon, and night. And you know,
did he seem homesick? Did he seem homesick, like he was missing his family? I mean, there's a lot of that, because he was off. He never, from my understanding,
I don't know. That might be just the family, like, hoping that he was homesick.
Maybe.
He didn't seem that homesick to me.
So we had the album done, the very first album, and after we'd finished recording that first album, when we were sort of mixing and listening back to everything, we thought, hang on, there's something special going on here. We knew that we had a special product. And you see, during the recording of it, you don't really take as much notice. If you're in the eye of the hurricane, you just get on with it and do it. But when we sat back at the end of it, we thought, hang on, there's something special going on here. And it really was. It did gel, and it was a nice combination of chemistry and within the band.
Looking back, it might look that there was all of a sudden they were huge, but actually they weren't.
Yeah.
It was just sort of, they were still sort of getting out on the road and doing some touring, and nobody knew if it was going to work or not. They had a lot of problems getting that record sold. You know, everybody turned it down. Eventually, of course, Jet picked it up. Don Arden picked it up, but there are quite a few people in the music business even now that can show you the rejection slip for Blizzard of Oz, and of course to their chagrin now, of course. But right. So it wasn't this big. Oh, we got fucking Guns N' Roses. You know what I mean? It wasn't a Appetite for Destruction kind of deal. It was very much a sort of a, well, the first record's out there. We did some touring, you know, let's make another good record and, you know, let's see how it goes. You know, it really wasn't, it wasn't a huge success.
A one-hit wonder, sort of like.
Yeah, exactly. It wasn't a big, huge success. It seemed to be getting some good reviews from America. Say, the whole band were very straightforward guys. Ozzy's very straightforward. He's a funny guy. The band is funny. They're in there having fun. They're all great players. You know, I mean, it's just a great situation. And basically, everybody's on the same side. We're all looking to try and make the best possible record. And it was just a lovely time, really.